All right, well, this will be a good overview. Real estate tokenization. So tokenization is basically taking a property and creating a digital asset out of it. Everybody has heard of crypto and all of those types of things. And there are pros and cons to it. And I'm not here to talk about crypto, but I'm here to talk about some of the underlying technologies that have evolved that may or may not have application in real estate. But the tokenization is basically taking the ownership. So we've talked a lot about the ownership models throughout history. And a new ownership model is tokenizing real estate, where you take a building or a piece of land or a real asset, and then you essentially create a digital asset version of it, which can then be bought and sold and traded. In a nutshell, that's what it is. Again, being kind of a fan of history, I'm going to go back. This time, I won't go back to ancient Greece on this one. I'll just go back to Florence in 1429. The Medici Bank was a Florentine bank that created a system. What they did was, before that, you had to take gold coins and gold and physical assets and move them from city to city to city if you wanted to trade things. But the Medici, and here's Cosimo Medici looking at one of his inventions. It's not to say that this was the first and only thing, but this was one that arrived at kind of a scale that was very significant. Letter of credit. I record that you have given me 500 gold coins in London, and I'm going to record in Venice, that happened so that you can trade in Venice on all throughout Europe on that map. Very important to the idea of transactions, because real estate tokenization is basically a transaction system, right? You're moving ownership of real estate from one place to another. You have printed checks invented more or less in London, and you have a group of London bankers who are clearing these check payments. In 1770, they're meeting at a tavern, doing this kind of informally. Within 50 years, they've built a whole building. They're doing 2 to 3 million clearings of checks. This payment has gone from this person to this person, all with paper. And then in 1861, Western Union completes its wire network, its telegraph network across the United States. And shortly thereafter, about 10 years later, somebody has the idea that we could use this, instead of just sending messages, we can use it to send money. So the first electronic payment is really pretty much 1873. Western Union is doing some other innovations where they're creating cards, these metal cards that have account numbers, which make it easier for you to collect those payments. And that's about 1914. And this is all being privately done, right? So this is kind of private enterprise. But in 1918, this is 1925, which is when this map was created, but in 1918, the Federal Reserve creates its banking network in the United States, creates 12 banks, which is what we still have today, and they create a leased wire system so that they can now start making large transfers of payments across the United States, which had massive ramifications for being able to move all of this money so easily. What I wanted to point out with this one is you have a private network that's been created. You see Boston in the upper right hand, you see San Francisco as kind of the main lines by Western Union, and then about 50 years later, the government is now creating their system based on a similar kind of geospatial architecture, if you will. So one of the takeaways here is that the end depends on the beginning. Things are built in this kind of cumulative way. 40 years later, 30, 40 years later, you have the introduction of a credit card. So now you have individual people who are not only enabled to send payments to one another like they were able to do with Western Union, but now they can create a credit market and borrow against that in a very easy way. There's a very interesting story about this that I don't have time to get into, but it started in Fresno, California, if you want to learn more about it. So now move forward, we're in the late 60s and we're back in England. So this bankers clearinghouse that was being done around the Revolutionary War time has been operating and operating and operating. But the computer is now the new piece of the equation. And so they find a way to automate. And so BACS is the bankers automated clearing system to start automating these processes. And then fast forward to one person I'm sure you know on the right, Peter Thiel. How many folks here know who Peter Thiel is? 1, 2, 3. So Peter Thiel was he co-founded PayPal, but he also was the first investor in Facebook. So that worked out pretty well for him. And now Elon Musk, everybody I think knows who Elon Musk is. In a way, he's kind of the Cosimo de' Medici of today, in some ways. And he started it in, looking at transactions. 2008, you have a Bitcoin white paper, and I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with Bitcoin. It's a cryptocurrency. But the thing that I really want to emphasize in here is that, as you see in the first line, it is a purely peer-to-peer version of electronic cash. So historically, we've always had, a bank in between or some other financial institution in between. And that's what you're seeing in this diagram on the left. You've got now a decentralized system wherein that intermediary has been removed. And that's really kind of one of the main features of Bitcoin that has gotten people very interested. Not only the fact that it, as a currency, has returned incredible rates of return, as many successful cryptocurrencies have, but the real potential here, or it's again, there's a pro and a con. When you take the banking system as we traditionally know it out of the equation, what's the potential? Not everything is a panacea of good things, as we saw from some of our earlier systems. So how do you kind of balance some things that are technologically very advantageous with assuring that things are being done in a way that brings an ethical dimension to it? All right, so the Bitcoin node map here just shows the proliferation of this system globally. Again, it's starting to feel a little bit like that REIT diagram that we looked at, where now you have a globally fluid system that is completely disintermediated and has no central governance mechanism. It's kind of taking the nation state out of the equation. Again, I'm just pointing these things out. I'm not saying a value one way or the other. I just want you to be aware of how these things work. So finally, you have the Ethereum white paper, which was written by Vitalik Buterin in 2014 when he was 19 years old. And what this is really saying is, what if we could take that decentralized network of digital currencies that can move from person to person without anything in between, and what if we could actually put code, like a computer, inside the currency? I know this might be a little hard to conceptualize, but this is a good diagram. Imagine on the bottom you have a tenant and they pay money to a smart contract. The smart contract is that executing code, right? And so the code is inside the token, if you will. It's embedded within the currency. So the currency, through an automated system, as we saw in England, this idea of automating an entire way of paying and distributing payments without all these other people involved is one of the technological potentials for it. It also has the potential to embed certain values into it. And I won't get into all the ways you could. I kind of don't want to be overly prescriptive or didactic here. It's just think like, this is a tool that is existing and it is rapidly emerging, to the point where the Federal Reserve of Boston, just down the street, is working now with MIT to evaluate a digital currency, central bank digital currency. And 1 week ago, the Bank of England announced that it is also joining, that research collaborative to evaluate what it would look like. Some people have kind of called it Britcoin, but we'll see. We don't know if it's going to happen, but one of the issues is that as the other systems begin to generate momentum, the policymakers, as they rightly should, need to be more actively engaged in this process. I'm going to flip through a few slides. Okay, so we have some knowledge of history. We have some knowledge of technologies. I'll just let you read these. According to the World Economic Forum. And that's the end of my presentation. So, thanks.